In the heart of Lagos, where the streets never rest and the sun often burns hot against the earth, lived Amaka, a young wife who carried herself with pride far greater than her modest means. She and her husband Ifeanyi were not wealthy by any true measure, but Amaka found joy in little displays that made her feel above others. A new wrapper here, a polished gait there, and the careful way she walked as though the world itself owed her respect. She loved being admired, and even more, she loved being envied. One sweltering afternoon, while the neighborhood buzzed with children playing and traders shouting, a frail figure appeared at her gate. His clothes were torn, his face carried the exhaustion of days without rest, and his voice came soft but steady. "Madam, please." "Just a little food," the man pleaded. His name was Chukwudi, though Amaka did not care to know it. He stood there with humility, his eyes heavy but his tone respectful. Amaka looked at him with scorn, folding her arms. To her, he was nothing but a burden, a man too weak to strive, too lazy to earn his way. With a sharp tone, she said, "Go and work for your own bread. Nobody gave us what we have. We struggled for it." Her words cut harder than the hunger in his belly. She yanked the gate shut with force, the clang echoing down the street. The sound was final, a barrier not just of metal, but of dignity. Chukwudi did not shout back. He did not beg again. Instead, his eyes lingered for a long moment through the narrow slit of the gate, eyes that carried quiet pain, yet no anger. He stood in silence, his face unreadable, his posture calm despite the insult. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowded street. Behind the slammed gate, Amaka felt nothing but satisfaction. She believed she had taught a lazy beggar a lesson. Yet, in that brief exchange, a seed was planted, one that would grow into a story she could never have imagined. For sometimes the man you dismiss today may return tomorrow in a robe of power. That evening, as the sun melted into the Lagos skyline and the streets filled with the sound of returning workers, Ifeanyi came home weary from another long day at the office. His shirt was damp with sweat, his shoes dusty from the walk, yet his face carried the quiet dignity of a man who tried every day to give his family a better life. Amaka welcomed him with the same mixture of pride and impatience she always carried. As they sat to eat, she recounted with laughter how a beggar had come to their gate earlier, daring to ask for food. She mimicked his voice, her eyes flashing with mockery, before proudly declaring how she sent him away. Ifeanyi's hand froze midway as he raised his spoon. His eyes, gentle yet filled with thought, lingered on his wife. "Amaka," he said softly, "was that necessary?" She frowned, surprised at his tone. "A man too lazy to work should not eat," she replied sharply. "We have our own struggles. Why waste what little we have on strangers who do nothing?" Ifeanyi sighed, placing his spoon down. His voice was calm, but each word carried the weight of truth. "My wife, remember. Fortune turns like the wind. Today we may have, tomorrow we may not. A man in rags is still a man. Life has a way of humbling the proud." Amaka rolled her eyes, dismissing his words as the weakness of a small dreamer. "You men of little salary always speak like philosophers." "No," she said coldly. "But tell me, when has the wind ever turned for men like you? The poor remain poor, and the rich only grow richer." Her words stung, but Ifeanyi did not argue. He simply looked at her with quiet sadness, then bowed his head and returned to his meal. He had no riches, no great power, but he carried wisdom she refused to see. That night, while Amaka dreamed of silk dresses and grand houses, Ifeanyi lay awake, troubled not by poverty itself, but by the arrogance of the woman he loved, unaware that her pride would one day test them both. The days rolled into weeks, and the glow of Amaka's pride slowly dimmed under the heavy shadow of reality. Lagos life was not kind to small earners like Ifeanyi. His junior clerk job barely stretched to cover rent, transport, and the most basic food. Each month ended with debts piling higher, and yet the prices in the market only seemed to rise. Bags of rice cost more, bread shrank in size, and kerosene for their stove ate deeper into their pockets. Still, Ifeanyi endured with quiet patience, believing that hard work, though slow, would one day open a door. Amaka, however, was restless. She did not see patience as strength. She saw it as weakness. To her, every unpaid bill was proof of her husband's failure. Every torn shoe or faded dress was a reminder that she was trapped in the life of a small man's wife. When neighbors bought new furniture or spoke of trips to the city mall, jealousy gnawed at her heart. She wanted more, and she wanted it fast. One evening, as Ifeanyi returned with his weary smile, she could not hold back her bitterness. "So this is it?" she snapped, her arms folded tightly. "Month after month, we scrape and struggle. Your salary cannot even feed us properly. Do you want me to live the rest of my life as a poor man's wife?" Her words struck like a knife. Ifeanyi sat quietly, his tired eyes clouded with sorrow. "Amaka, I am trying. You know I am. Things are hard everywhere." But she only scoffed, her voice rising. "Hard? Or are you just a man too content with little? Look at yourself, working like a donkey, yet nothing changes. A small man's salary. That's all you bring home." The room grew heavy with silence. Ifeanyi's lips trembled, but he said nothing more. In that moment, his pain was not only the struggle to survive, it was the sting of his wife's contempt. Amaka turned away, convinced she deserved a life far above their means, blind to the truth that pride and hardship often deepens the struggle. The months dragged on with the same rhythm of struggle until one morning, a notice pinned on the office board caught Ifeanyi's tired eyes. A reputable company in the city was hiring for a higher position, one that promised better pay, respect, and stability. For the first time in a long while, his heart stirred with hope. The thought of breaking free from the endless cycle of scraping by gave him courage. That evening, he brought the news home, his voice carrying both excitement and uncertainty. Amaka's eyes lit up instantly, not with quiet gratitude, but with burning dreams. She clasped her hands together, already painting pictures in her mind. New clothes, finer furniture, better neighbors who would finally envy her. "This is it, Ifeanyi," she exclaimed, pacing the room. "This is the chance we've been waiting for. You must get that job. Do you hear me? No excuses." Ifeanyi smiled faintly, though his palms sweated. He had never been a man of loud confidence. He was steady but simple, honest but unsure in the face of grandeur. "I will try, Amaka," he said softly. "I will do my best." But Amaka was relentless. She began to coach him, not on the strength of his integrity, but on the image he must project. She pressed his best shirt, polished his worn shoes until they shone, and lectured him on how to speak with pride. To her, this was not just a job interview. It was a ticket to the life she craved. In the quiet of night, Ifeanyi lay awake, his mind swirling with both fear and determination. He knew this opportunity could change their story, but he also feared failing, not for himself, but for the expectations now resting heavily on his shoulders. Amaka, meanwhile, slept peacefully, dreaming of the grand house she was certain awaited them. What neither of them knew was that this single decision, this hopeful application, would soon unravel a twist fate had been weaving since the day a beggar knocked on their gate. Their turning point was here, but not in the way Amaka imagined. The morning of the interview arrived with a weight heavier than the Lagos heat. Ifeanyi dressed carefully, his heart pounding with every button he fastened. Amaka hovered nearby, fussing over his collar, adjusting his tie, reminding him again and again that this was their moment to rise. She held her head high as they stepped out, her mind already leaping ahead to the life of respect and luxury she believed was within reach. The company headquarters stood tall and glassy, a towering symbol of wealth and success. As they walked through the polished doors into the grand reception, Ifeanyi's hands trembled. He whispered silent prayers beneath his breath, while Amaka strutted forward as though she already owned the place. They were led into the executive office, and then the air shifted in an instant. Behind the mahogany desk, seated in a fine tailored suit, was a man whose presence commanded the room. His face was calm, his posture firm, his aura one of authority and quiet strength. Amaka froze. Her lips parted, her eyes widened, her chest tightened. It was him, the beggar, the same weary man she had once sent away from her gate, the man she mocked as lazy and useless. Chukwudi. Her knees nearly buckled. Memories of that afternoon came rushing back, the scorn in her voice, the slam of the gate. the way his eyes had lingered with silent pain. Now those same eyes, sharper and steadier, looked at her with a recognition she wished he had forgotten. Ifeanyi, oblivious to the past connection, stepped forward nervously to greet the managing director. "Good morning, sir," he said with a small bow, clutching his file of credentials. Chukwudi nodded slowly, his gaze flicking between husband and wife. Amaka lowered her head, trembling inside, afraid of what would come next. The world had spun full circle in ways she could never have imagined. The man she despised as a beggar now sat in power, and the fate of her husband's future rested in his hands. Chukwudi leaned back in his leather chair, his sharp suit fitting him like a second skin. The years of struggle that once bent his shoulders were gone. Now he carried himself with the calm assurance of a man who had risen above every chain of poverty. As Ifeanyi nervously stepped forward with his file, Chukwudi's gaze shifted ever so slightly toward Amaka. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and in that moment, a silent storm passed between them. She stiffened, her throat dry, her palms damp with fear. But Chukwudi gave nothing away. Instead, he allowed a faint smile, almost hidden, tug at the corner of his lips. He turned his full attention to Ifeanyi, who was unaware of the history unfolding silently beside him. "Good morning, sir," Ifeanyi greeted, bowing politely, his voice trembling with both respect and nerves. "Good morning," Chukwudi replied smoothly, his voice steady and deep. "Please, have a seat." Amaka's heart pounded as she watched the exchange. She wanted to shrink into the floor, to escape the eyes of the man who now had every reason to crush her husband's hopes. Her pride, once her armor, now burned like fire on her skin. Chukwudi listened as Ifeanyi introduced himself, speaking of his years as a clerk, his diligence, and his desire to grow. Every word was sincere, every gesture humble. And still, Chukwudi's gaze occasionally drifted back to Amaka, not with anger, but with a quiet knowing. She lowered her eyes each time, unable to withstand the weight of his memory. The tables had turned. The woman who once slammed a gate in his face now sat trembling in his presence, while the husband who had nothing more than honesty to offer pleaded for a chance at a better future. Chukwudi said little, but his silence carried power. For he knew in that moment that life had brought them face to face, not for revenge, but for a lesson Amaka would never forget. And so he hid his smile, watching quietly as destiny played its hand. Amaka's heart raced faster than her breath. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead, though the office was cool and quiet. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she clutched her purse, eyes darting toward Chukwudi, who sat with calm authority behind his desk. The sight of him dressed in power, the very man she once turned away in rags, gnawed at her like a nightmare come alive. She leaned toward Ifeanyi, tugging at his sleeve. "Husband," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "I must tell you something. Now." Ifeanyi frowned, confused. They stepped aside into a corner of the waiting room, away from Chukwudi's steady gaze. Amaka's lips quivered as the confession spilled out. "That man, the managing director, he is the beggar who came to our gate months ago. The one I mocked. The one I drove away without mercy. It is him, Ifeanyi. I swear it is him." Ifeanyi froze, his mind reeling. At first he thought she was mistaken, but the terror in her eyes left no doubt. His chest tightened, his stomach sank. "Amaka, you did this?" he asked, his voice low and heavy with disbelief. She nodded, tears threatening to fall. Shame burned across Ifeanyi's face. The memory of her cruelty, which he once overlooked, now returned with brutal weight. He imagined Chukwudi's silent pain that day at the gate, and now here he was, the man with power to decide their future. Ifeanyi buried his face in his hands, realizing that his wife's pride might cost him the one opportunity he had prayed for. "Do you understand what this means?" he whispered harshly. "You insulted the very man who now holds my destiny in his hands." Amaka clutched his arm desperately. "Please, Ifeanyi, do not let him destroy us. Beg if you must, but save us." Ifeanyi looked at her with anguish. He had carried the weight of poverty for years, but this was different. This was the weight of her arrogance. And as he glanced back at Chukwudi, seated in silent power, he felt the cold truth. This interview was no longer about qualifications. It was about character, and his wife's pride might have doomed them both. Chukwudi adjusted his cufflinks and leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Ifeanyi with the calm intensity of a man who had seen both hunger and abundance. He pressed a button, and the secretary ushered Ifeanyi into the office. Amaka remained outside, her hands clasped tightly together, her heart hammering as if each beat carried her shame louder than words. Inside, the air felt heavier. Ifeanyi bowed politely, clutching his file like a lifeline. Chukwudi studied him in silence for a moment before speaking. "Tell me, Mr. Ifeanyi," he began, his voice deep but steady, "why do you want this job?" Ifeanyi swallowed hard. His answer was not polished, not rehearsed. "Sir, I want this job because I want to give my family a better life. I have worked hard for years with little progress, but I have never lost my will to serve faithfully. I want to grow, not just for myself, but for those who depend on me." Chukwudi nodded slowly, then leaned forward. "What would you do if offered wealth through dishonest means?" Without hesitation, Ifeanyi replied, "I would refuse, sir. A man may suffer today with little, but if he loses his integrity, he loses everything. Money can be regained, but a broken name cannot be repaired." For the first time, Chukwudi's lips curved into a faint smile. He asked again, "And loyalty? Do you serve only when the pay is good, or when times are hard as well?" Ifeanyi's voice grew firmer. "Loyalty means standing by duty, even when it is not easy. A true man does not abandon his work in storms. That is who I am." Chukwudi studied him closely, his sharp eyes occasionally drifting to the glass wall that separated them from the waiting area. Through it, he could see Amaka, her head bowed in shame, her pride stripped bare. But he said nothing of it. Instead, he returned his gaze to Ifeanyi. The test was not about brilliance or charm. It was about the strength of a man's heart. And in that quiet office, Ifeanyi's honesty shone brighter than any polished resume. When the interview ended, Ifeanyi stepped out of the office with a mixture of hope and fear in his eyes. He clutched his file tightly, whispering a prayer under his breath. Amaka rose to meet him, but before she could speak, the secretary approached. "Madam, the director would like a word with you," she said politely. Amaka's breath caught in her throat. Her legs felt weak as she walked back into the office, every step heavy with dread. Chukwudi sat calmly behind his desk, his expression unreadable. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, her hands trembling. The silence stretched until he finally spoke. "Do you remember me, madam?" His voice was steady, yet it cut like a blade. Amaka's lips quivered. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. "Yes, I remember," she whispered, shame burning through her. Chukwudi leaned forward slightly. "That day at your gate, I was hungry for bread," he said slowly. "But what hurt more than hunger was the way you looked at me. You taught me the hunger of dignity, the pain of being seen as less than human." Tears welled in Amaka's eyes. She wanted to fall to her knees to beg for mercy, but words failed her. She braced herself for humiliation, for revenge. Instead, Chukwudi's tone softened. "But life is a teacher, Amaka, and I have learned that success without compassion is empty. I will not repay cruelty with cruelty. I choose forgiveness." Her tears broke free, streaming down her face. She had expected punishment, but instead she was handed grace. Chukwudi's calm eyes held no malice, only wisdom forged from hardship. "Go," he said gently. "Do not despise the man in rags. Tomorrow you may bow before him in robes." Amaka nodded, her chest heaving with sobs. In that moment, she understood that pride had cost her dignity, but mercy had saved her from ruin. She left the office humbled, carrying a lesson she would never forget. Days later, the letter finally arrived. Ifeanyi tore it open with shaking hands, his heart pounding in his chest. Amaka stood beside him, her breath caught between hope and fear. When his eyes scanned the words, they widened, and his lips curved into a trembling smile. "Amaka," he whispered, "I got the job." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Amaka gasped, covering her mouth as tears rushed to her eyes. Their lives, which had been weighed down by endless debts and mocking hunger, were about to change. Ifeanyi embraced her tightly, his relief washing over him like a river after drought. Yet even in her joy, Amaka's heart carried a heavy stone. She knew this blessing came not because of her pride, but in spite of it. As weeks turned into months, their home transformed. The cupboards were no longer empty. The landlord no longer knocked for unpaid rent, and Amaka now wore dresses she once only admired on others. Neighbors who used to pity her now greeted her with respect. But though her life grew brighter, her spirit grew quieter. The memory of Chukwudi's calm eyes and his words of grace never left her. One evening, as she watched her husband prepare for another day at the company, she whispered softly, Ifeanyi, I was wrong. Wealth is not the true measure of a man. I mocked the poor, forgetting tomorrow is hidden. Never again. Ifeanyi placed his hand on hers, relief flooding his heart. At last she had seen the truth he had always carried. In the grand office where he worked, Chukwudi remained a steady presence. Powerful, respected, yet humble. His words echoed long after their meeting. Never despise a man in rags. You may meet him again in robes. Amaka carried those words deep within her soul. They became her quiet prayer, her guiding wisdom, the reminder that life's wheel spins in ways no man can predict. Pride had once blinded her, but humility had opened her eyes. And so, her story turned full circle. Not with vengeance, but with grace, teaching all who listened that respect is the seed of true honor.